Okay, thinking about yoga and manifesting prosperity and success requires that we clearly distinguish between yoga as a contribution to philosophy and then a kind of a practical theory that you could live by, an ethical theory, and a alternative that sometimes looks like yoga or sometimes we confuse with yoga. And the alternative is what philosophers call consequentialism. Okay, so consequentialism is a pretty famous ethical theory. You can find examples of this in the Western tradition and in the South Asian tradition. So according to consequentialism, the reason you do something is for some end, some goal, some good, right? And consequentialists could take all sorts of views on what that good is. So the famous versions you usually identify pleasure or happiness as the end that justifies some action, or the minimization of pain and suffering. But it doesn't have to be that. You could decide like money is your end, and then that justifies a course of action. So for consequentialism, the only reason you do something is because either the action is supposed to produce that outcome that you want, maybe it's the money, or maybe it's happiness or something, or maybe it doesn't do it on an occasion, but overall that kind of activity tends to produce happiness or money, so you do it, right? So if you're the former variety of consequentialist who thinks that we have to look at each action separately and just do what will it promises to bring about some good on an occasion, you're called an act consequentialist. If you think that there are certain rules or patterns of behavior that we should adopt because over time they produce some end or good that you want, you're a rule consequentialist. Okay, so consequentialism, I think, shows up in the yoga world insofar as yoga tries to accommodate itself in the business of health and well-being, right? And so people market yoga as a means to some type of end, right? Maybe it's like peace of mind or emotional stability, or maybe physical health, or perhaps it's that kind of that look, right? So if you go on Instagram is just filled with people uh, in these yoga asana poses who are all model-esque, and and the idea is, or what we're kind of encouraged to associate with these pictures is that somehow, if you buy what they're selling, you will look like them. Or, maybe if you take their classes, you will look like them. Or, right? That psychology where you associate something that you find attractive and you want with some supposed means to that end, right? That assumes consequentialism in the background. And it's just kind of a very natural part of the way people think about things like yoga. I think it's a real challenge for people who are serious about yoga and serious about being the business of yoga to distinguish what it is that they're doing from that. Okay, because consequentialism isn't yoga. Yoga is not a version of the theory that says that you should do something because there's some type of promised end. Okay, now the reason that yoga is not that, or the reason that yogis should really not want to be some type of consequentialist, is because consequentialism is an ethical theory with like a ton of problems that you don't want. Okay, so one problem that consequentialism has, and this is actually something identified in the South Asian tradition, in the Indian tradition. If you look at kind of early yoga philosophy, there is this keen awareness that whenever people are trying to sell to you this package, this idea that you're supposed to do something for some end, chances are there isn't really a strong connection between the thing that you're supposed to do in the end. And in the very early tradition, it was sacrifices to the gods, right? You do these sacrifices to the gods, and then you're supposed to get something good in return. But people started getting kind of suspicious because, like, you could do the sacrifice for rain. It doesn't mean it's going to rain. But like that was their version of consequentialism, right? But now you can think about all the supposed means to being happy that are out there that, if you were to somehow buy or embrace, would guarantee happiness. And, there isn't a great success rate with simply kind of doing something to make yourself happy. Or think about money for that matter, right? Like you say you want to be a millionaire, right? People can tell you that, oh, well, you should do X, Y, and Z and you'll get rich. And, there's a lot of financial advice out there, but it's not like if you follow all that financial advice, you're going to be a millionaire, right? You can even go ask millionaires, how did you do it? Or billionaires, how did you do it? And they will tell you some story about how it's possible. And then you can go out and try and do it. And, chances are you will not become a billionaire, right? And that's because that entire process where we think about certain actions as justified by way of their ends is problematic. So there's at least two different kinds of problems associated with this project. The first is that if an end is unlikely, like say being a billionaire, right? And if that end is there to justify some action, right? Maybe going to business school, right? People are like, oh, go to business school, you'll become a billionaire. It's not true, right? Most people who go to business school do not become billionaires, right? But if the end is unlikely, and being a billionaire is an unlikely end, right? That means that that it proportionally unjustifies some type of action, depending on how unlikely it is, right? So if it's really unlikely that you're going to be a billionaire, right? But the means to become a billionaire is to say, become a banker or, go to business school or something like that, right? That end doesn't give you good reason to go to business school or become a banker, because the end is unlikely, and so the means are kind of, in proportion unjustified. So that's kind of one problem. So if you were to think about something you really want, really special, it's probably going to be something a little unusual and rare. But then in proportion to how rare it is, it becomes something that you don't really have good reason to act on, because it's unlikely that you can do anything that can bring that about. But if the only reason to do something is for that end, then you don't really have, it's as though life becomes meaningless and purposeless pretty quickly, simply because you have some type of far-fetched goal in mind, right? So that's one problem. It doesn't actually give you very good reason to do very much. And in fact, it seems to give you reason to downgrade your expectations, right, to something less rare, more likely. But then, right, what you're likely to do is to choose a course of action that brings about some type of end that isn't really all that special, because it's the kind of thing you could easily do. That, like, go outside and stick your hand in the mud. Look, mud, right? So consequentialism becomes kind of this rather strange race to the bottom, where if the only reason to do something is some supposed end, then the justification for that action increases in proportion to the likelihood of actually producing that end, and decreases in proportion to how unlikely that end is. And it turns out that the things that are, that are kind of special or unusual are unlikely, right? So you will consequentialism will kind of lead you to a kind of program of mediocrity pretty quickly, because those are the kinds of things that you have a high chance of succeeding at. So, consequentialism is kind of it seems like a great idea at first, right? Like, well, the reason I'm doing X is because it's going to bring me the thing I want, right? And so then the thing that you want is supposed to give meaning and purpose to the things that you do. But the more special the thing that you want, and the less likely, the less it gives meaning and purpose to the things that you do in order to bring that about, right? So very quickly it'll lead to all sorts of failure. I mean, one reason to think that yoga is a form of consequentialism is that you do it. There is a kind of optimism and hope about good results in yoga, right? There are several different values in the practice of yoga. You find in the Yoga Sutra that suggest you should be optimistic about practicing yoga, such as Shraddha, that is having faith that things are going to turn out well, and Santosh, being content with your practice, right? Both of these are attitudes of optimism that things are going to turn out well. And, without that optimism, it might be difficult to actually keep up with the practice, right? But also the idea is that, like, if you do it, things will get better for you, right? Or at least there's a kind of a promise that you have to buy in order to practice yoga. But then you might think, oh, but look, this is just kind of goofy, right? It's just a promise. It's not a guarantee. And so maybe people who do this kind of thing are just kind of, they're giving up on consequentialism, if yoga is in consequentialism, but they're just kind of living in make-believe. Okay, so the reason why yogis don't have to worry about these criticisms is that yoga is a completely different ethical theory with a different way of thinking about the meaning and purpose of your actions. Okay, so yoga is this idea that we should live life as a practice, and this practice is a devotional practice. And what we're devoted to is the ideal of the practice. And so the practice we are committed to is the practice of being ourselves, people. And the ideal of this is the ideal of personhood, Ishvara. Okay, it's the Lord of the practice. And the idea then is that in practicing what it is for us to be people and being devoted to this ideal of personhood, we are doing the right thing all the time, okay? But, and more importantly, if we can actually perfect the practice, and we perfect the practice by being committed to the practice, then what happens is that we start to get good at the practice, and then good things start to happen because we are perfecting the practice of being ourselves, right? And if we want to understand what we are, we have to think about this ideal of personhood. But the ideal of personhood is this thing without, that isn't stuck with past constraints, and is free to move forward to a future of its own choosing. Right? People are the kinds of things that thrive when they are free to move from their past into a future that's receptive to them, right? And so so when we practice yoga, the reason we do it isn't because we're expecting some type of good or end afterwards. That isn't the justification. Rather, the meaningfulness of the practice has to do with our devotion to this ideal of being ourselves. Okay, but then the idea is that good things happen as you perfect this practice. Okay, and more importantly, right, the good things that happen become increasingly likely in proportion to our practice, right? So you can think about any practice, like playing the guitar or the violin, right? It's unlikely that you will be good if you don't practice. But the more you practice, the likelihood of you being good at that practice increases, right? So the goodness of the practice is something that increases with your practice, and the likelihood of your succeeding increases with your practice, right? So whereas consequentialism kind of gives you reasons to lower your expectations, right? And apparently kind of deprives you of any sense of meaning for, for doing things for unusual and great goals. Yoga gives you a confident path to success, because the meaningfulness has to do with simply you working on yourself, and the goodness is something that's it's gonna fall out of the practice as you keep up with it. Okay, so if you're thinking about the issues of kind of manifesting success and prosperity, right, yoga provides you a frame for thinking about what that would look like, right? In a way, it's about kind of you being you, but like perfectly you, without all the interference. And the success and prosperity that you have is simply just a kind of an expression of you as someone who's living their life successfully. Okay, so one challenge you might think to this way of thinking about prosperity and success as something that you manifest is that, well, look, there's so many actions that we need to do in order for purely instrumental reasons. And then it seems like we're back to consequentialism, right? So, the only reason I vacuum the rug is because the vacuum sucks up the dust. So the justification for vacuuming the rug is that end of having no dust and stuff on the rug, right? But if that's the justification, it seems like I'm thinking consequentially about vacuuming. And proportionally, it seems like there would be simply no point, 0 point to vacuuming if the process didn't actually result in, wasn't justified by kind of there being no dust on the ground. Okay, so the challenge then is to find a way to understand how this criticism is really a criticism, or and it's really a criticism insofar as it kind of expresses a kind of consequentialist insight. But I think it's somewhat mistaken, because if you think about something like vacuuming, right, the reason you do it is part of your own regulation of your life, right? That, insofar you're vacuuming your own home, or maybe you're doing it as part of your job, right? But the activity has meaning insofar it's part of you being in control of your life. And so there's a way in which any consequentialist action that you think you need to do for some end can be re-understood, if it really is a good end, right, as an activity you are engaging in as part of your own self-control and your self-manifestation and your self-realization. So one of the funny things about ordinary activities is that under a consequentialist description, they're kind of meaningless. You only do them for some end, right? But under a yoga redescription, they're completely meaningful because they're an opportunity for you to practice yoga, right? They're an opportunity for you to be in charge of your life, to do something, and to do it successfully, right? And it can be small things like cleaning the bathroom or, sweeping the floor. All of these are ways in which you can exert your own capacity to bring about good results, right? Now, these are just kind of small examples, right? But they're daily examples that we, unless you never have to do these kinds of things, right? Most people have to deal with. And so the question is, well, how is it that, most of us that aren't kind of born billionaires, how is it that we bring about success in our life, right? And really, I think what's interesting about yoga is it's telling us, don't go ask a billionaire, right? Because they probably have no clue, right? They just kind of got rich and they're kind of lucky, right? You have to think about starting from the ground up. What does success look like when you were starting at the bottom and you're working yourself up, right? And the only way it's going to work on the yoga account is if the very process of success has to do with you living a life that's meaningful by virtue of you practicing what it is to be you.